Chapter 2. The Kowtow Question and the Opium War. At the close of the 18th century, China stood at the height of its imperial greatness. The Qing dynasty, established in 1644 by Manchu tribes riding into China from the northeast, had turned China into a major military power, fusing Manchu and Mongol military prowess with the cultural and governmental prowess of the Han Chinese. It embarked on a program of territorial expansion to the north and west, establishing a Chinese sphere of influence deep into Mongolia, Tibet, and modern-day Xinjiang. China stood predominant in Asia. It was at least the rival of any empire on earth. Yet the high point of the Qing dynasty also turned into the turning point of its destiny. For China's wealth and expanse attracted the attention of Western empires and trading companies operating far outside the bounds and conceptual apparatus of the traditional Chinese world order. For the first time in its history, China faced barbarians who no longer sought to displace the Chinese dynasty and claim the mandate of heaven for themselves. Instead, they proposed to replace the Sino-centric system with an entirely new vision of world order with free trade. Rather than tribute, resident embassies in the Chinese capital, and a system of diplomatic exchange that did not refer to non-Chinese heads of state as honorable barbarians pledging fealty to their emperor in Beijing. Unbeknownst to Chinese elites, these foreign societies had developed new industrial and scientific methods that, for the first time in centuries or perhaps ever, surpassed China's own. Steam power, railways, and new methods of manufacturing and capital formation enabled enormous advances in productivity in the West, imbued with a conquering impulse that propelled them into China's traditional sphere of dominance. The Western powers considered Chinese claims of universal overlordship over Europe and Asia risible. They were determined to impose on China their own standards of international conduct, by force if necessary. The resulting confrontation challenged the basic Chinese cosmology and left wounds still festering. Over a century later, in an age of restored Chinese eminence, beginning in the 17th century, Chinese authorities had noted the increasing numbers of European traders on the southeast China coast. They saw little to differentiate the Europeans from other foreigners operating at the fringes of the empire, save perhaps their particularly glaring lack of Chinese cultural attainments. In the official Chinese view, these West Sea barbarians were classified as tribute envoys or barbarian merchants. On rare occasions, some were permitted to travel to Beijing, where, if admitted into the presence of the emperor, they were expected to perform the ritual Kowtow, the act of prostration, with the forehead touching the ground 3 times. For foreign representatives, the points of entry into China and routes to the capital were strictly circumscribed. Access to the Chinese market was limited to a tightly regulated seasonal trade at Guangzhou, then known as Canton. Each winter, foreign merchants were required to sail home. They were not permitted to venture further into China. Regulations deliberately held them at bay. It was unlawful to teach the Chinese language to these barbarians, or to sell them books on Chinese history or culture. Their communications were to take place through specially licensed local merchants. The notion of free trade, resident embassies, and sovereign equality by this point, the minimum rights enjoyed by Europeans in almost every other corner of the world, were unheard of in China. One tacit exception had been made for Russia. Its rapid eastward expansion, the Tsar's domains now abutted Qing territories in Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Manchuria, placed it in a unique position to threaten China. The Qing dynasty, in 1715, permitted Moscow to establish a Russian Orthodox mission in Beijing. It eventually took on the role of a de facto embassy, the only foreign mission of its kind in China for over a century. The contacts extended to Western European traders. Limited as they were seen by the Qing as a considerable indulgence. The Son of Heaven had, in the Chinese view, shown his benevolence by allowing them to partake in Chinese trade, particularly in tea, silk, lacquerware, and rhubarb, for which the West Sea barbarians had developed a voracious appetite. Europe was too far from the Middle Kingdom ever to become Sinicized along Korean or Vietnamese lines. Initially, the Europeans accepted the role of supplicants in the Chinese tributary order, in which they were labeled as barbarians and their trade as tribute. But as the Western powers grew in wealth and conviction, this state of affairs grew untenable. The Mccartney mission. The assumptions of the Chinese world order were particularly offensive to Britain, the red-haired barbarians. In some Chinese records, as the premier Western commercial and naval power, Britain bridled at its assigned role in the cosmology of the Middle Kingdom, whose army, the British noted, still primarily used bows and arrows and whose navy was practically non-existent. British traders resented the increasing amount of squeeze extracted by the designated Chinese merchants at Guangzhou, through which Chinese regulations required that all Western trade be conducted. They sought access to the rest of the Chinese market beyond the southeast coast. The first major British attempt to remedy the situation was the 1793-94 mission of Lord George Mccartney to China. It was the most notable, best conceived, and least militaristic European effort to alter the prevailing format of Sino-Western relations and to achieve free trade and diplomatic representation on equal terms. It failed completely. The Mccartney mission is instructive to examine in some detail. The diary of the Envoy illustrates how the Chinese perception of its role operated in practice and the gulf existing between Western and Chinese perceptions of diplomacy. Mccartney was a distinguished public servant with years of international experience and a keen sense of Oriental diplomacy. He was a man of notable cultural achievements. He had served 3 years as envoy extraordinary to the court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg, where he negotiated a treaty of amity and commerce. Upon his return, he published a well-received volume of observations on Russian history and culture. He had subsequently served as governor of Madras. He was as well equipped as any of his contemporaries to inaugurate a new diplomacy across civilizations. The aims of the Mccartney mission to China would have seemed modest to any educated Briton of the time, especially compared with the recently established British dominion over the neighboring giant, India. Home Secretary Henry Dundas framed the Mccartney instructions as an attempt to achieve a free communication with a people, perhaps the most singular on the globe. Its principal aims were the establishment of reciprocal embassies in Beijing and London and commercial access to other ports along the Chinese coast. On the latter point, Dundas charged Mccartney to draw attention to the discouraging and arbitrary system of regulations at Guangzhou that prevented British merchants from engaging in the fair competition of the market, a concept with no direct counterpart in Confucian China. He was, Dundas stressed, to disclaim any territorial ambitions in China, an assurance bound to be considered as an insult by the recipient because it implied that Britain had the option to entertained such ambitions. The British government addressed the Chinese court on equal terms, which would have struck the British ruling group as affording a non-Western country an uncommon degree of dignity, while being treated in China as insubordinate insolence. Dundas instructed Mccartney to take the earliest opportunity to impress upon the Chinese court that King George III saw Mccartney's mission as an embassy to the most civilized as well as most ancient and populous nation in the world in order to observe its celebrated institutions, and to communicate and receive the benefits which must result from an unreserved and friendly intercourse between that country and his own. Dundas instructed Mccartney to comply with all ceremonials of that court, which may not commit the honor of your sovereign, or lessen your own dignity, so as to endanger the success of your negotiation. He should not, Dundas stressed, let any trifling punctilio stand in the way of the important benefits which may be obtained by success in his mission. To help further his aims, Mccartney brought with him numerous examples of British scientific and industrial prowess. Mccartney's entourage included a surgeon, a physician, a mechanic, a metallurgist, a watchmaker, a mathematical instrument maker, and 5 German musicians who were to perform nightly. These latter performances were one of the more successful aspects of the embassy. His gifts to the emperor included manufactures designed at least in part to show the fabulous benefits China might obtain by trading with Britain, artillery pieces, a chariot, diamond-studded wristwatches, British porcelain, copied, Qing officials noted approvingly, from the Chinese art form, and portraits of the king and queen, painted by Joshua Reynolds. Mccartney even brought a deflated hot air balloon and planned, without success, to have members of his mission fly it over Beijing by way of demonstration. The Mccartney mission accomplished none of its specific objectives. The gap in perceptions was simply too wide. Mccartney had intended to demonstrate the benefits of industrialization, but the emperor understood his gifts as tribute. The British envoy expected his Chinese hosts to recognize that they had been hopelessly left behind by the progress of technological civilization and to seek a special relationship with Britain to rectify their backwardness. In fact, the Chinese treated the British as an arrogant and uninformed barbarian tribe seeking special favor from the Son of Heaven. China remained wedded to its agrarian ways, with its burgeoning population making food production more urgent than ever, and its Confucian bureaucracy ignorant of the key elements of industrialization, steam power, credit and capital, private property, and public education. The first discordant note came as Mccartney and his entourage made their way to Johal, the summer capital, northeast of Beijing, traveling up the coast in Chinese yachts laden with generous gifts and delicacies but carrying Chinese signs proclaiming, "The English ambassador," bringing tribute to the Emperor of China. Mccartney resolved, in keeping with Dundas's instructions, to make no complaint of it, reserving myself to notice it if a proper opportunity occurs. As he approached Beijing, however, the chief mandarins charged with administering the mission opened a negotiation that put the gap in perceptions in sharper light. The issue was whether Mccartney would kowtow to the emperor or whether, as he insisted, he could follow the British custom of kneeling on one knee. The Chinese side opened the discussions in a circuitous manner by remarking on, as Mccartney recalled in his diary, the different modes of dress that prevailed among different nations. The mandarins concluded that Chinese Clothes were, in the end, superior, since they allowed the wearer to perform with greater ease the genuflections and prostrations which were, they said, customary to be made by all persons whenever the emperor appeared in public. Would the British delegation not find it easier to free itself of its cumbersome knee buckles and garters before approaching the emperor's august presence? Mccartney countered by suggesting that the emperor would likely appreciate if Mccartney paid him the same obeisance which I did to my own sovereign. The discussions over the Kowtow question continued intermittently for several more weeks. The mandarins suggested that Mccartney's options were to kowtow or to return home empty-handed. Mccartney resisted. Eventually, it was agreed that Mccartney could follow the European custom and kneel on one knee. It proved to be the only point Mccartney won, at least as to actual conduct. The official Chinese report stated that Mccartney, overwhelmed by the emperor's awesome majesty, had performed the kowtow after all. All of this took place within the intricate framework of Chinese protocol, which showed Mccartney the most considerate treatment in foiling and rejecting his proposals. Enveloped in all-encompassing protocol and assured that each aspect had a cosmically ordained and unalterable purpose, Mccartney found himself scarcely able to begin his negotiations. Meanwhile, he noted with a mixture of respect and unease the efficiency of China's vast bureaucracy, assessing that every circumstance concerning us and every word that falls from our lips is minutely reported and remembered. To Mccartney's consternation, the technological wonders of Europe left no visible impression on his handlers. When his party demonstrated their mounted cannons, our conductor pretended to think lightly of them, and spoke to us as if such things were no novelties in China. His lenses, chariot, and hot air balloon were brushed aside with polite condescension. A month and a half later, the ambassador was still waiting for an audience with the emperor, the interval having been consumed by banquets, entertainment, and discussions about the appropriate protocol for a possible imperial audience. Finally, he was summoned at 4 o'clock in the morning to a large, handsome tent to await the emperor, who presently appeared with great ceremony, borne in a palanquin. Mccartney wondered at the magnificence of Chinese protocol, in which every function of the ceremony was performed with such silence and solemnity as in some measure to resemble the celebration of a religious mystery. After bestowing gifts on Mccartney and his party, the emperor flattered the British party by sending us several dishes from his own table, and then giving to each of us, with his own hands, a cup of warm wine, which we immediately drank in his presence. Note that having the emperor personally serve wine to foreign envoys was specifically mentioned among the Han dynasty's 5 baits for barbarian management. The next day, Mccartney and party attended a convocation to celebrate the emperor's birthday. Finally, the emperor summoned Mccartney to his box at a theater performance. Now, Mccartney assumed he could transact the business of his embassy. Instead, the emperor rebuffed him with another gift, a box of precious stones, and Mccartney recorded a small book, written and painted by his own hand, which he desired me to present to the king, my master, as a token of his friendship, saying that the box had been 800 years in his family. Now that these tokens of imperial benevolence had been bestowed, the Chinese officials suggested that in view of the approaching cold winter, the time for Mccartney's departure had arrived. Mccartney protested that the two sides had yet to enter into negotiation on the items in his Official instructions, he had barely opened his commission. It was King George's wish, Mccartney stressed, that he be allowed to reside at the Chinese court as a permanent British ambassador. Early in the morning of October 3, 1793, a mandarin awoke Mccartney and summoned him in full ceremonial dress to the Forbidden City, where he was to receive the answer to his petition. After a wait of several hours, he was ushered up a staircase to a silk-covered chair, upon which sat not the emperor, but a letter from the emperor to King George. The Chinese officials kowtowed to the letter, leaving Mccartney to kneel to the letter on one knee. Finally, the imperial communication was transported back to Mccartney's chambers with full ceremony. It proved to be one of the most humiliating communications in the annals of British diplomacy. The edict began by remarking on King George's respectful humility in sending a tribute mission to China. You, O King, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. The emperor then dismissed every substantive request that Mccartney had made, including the proposal that Mccartney be permitted to reside in Beijing as a diplomat. As to your entreaty to send one of your nationals to be accredited to my celestial court and to be in control of your country's trade with China, this request is contrary to all usage of my dynasty and cannot possibly be entertained. He could not be allowed liberty of movement and the privilege of corresponding with his own country, so that you would gain nothing by his residence in our midst. The proposal that China send its own ambassador to London, the edict continued, was even more absurd. Supposing I sent an ambassador to reside in your country, how could you possibly make for him the requisite arrangements? Europe consists of many other nations besides your own. If each and all demanded to be represented at our court, how could we possibly consent? The thing is utterly impracticable. Perhaps, the emperor ascertained, King George had sent Mccartney to learn the blessings of civilization from China. But this, too, was out of the question. If you assert that your reverence for our celestial dynasty fills you with a desire to acquire our civilization, our ceremonies and code of laws differ so completely from your own that, even if your envoy were able to acquire the rudiments of our civilization, you could not possibly transplant our manners and customs to your alien soil. As for Mccartney's proposals regarding the benefits of trade between Britain and China, the Celestial Court had already shown the British great favor, allowing them full liberty to trade at Canton for many a year. Anything more was utterly unreasonable. As for the supposed benefits of British trade to China, Mccartney was sadly mistaken. Strange and costly objects do not interest me. If I have commanded that the tribute offerings sent by you, O King, are to be accepted, this was solely in consideration for the spirit which prompted you to dispatch them from afar. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. Given this state of affairs, trade beyond what was already taking place was impossible. Britain had nothing to offer that China wanted, and China had already given Britain all that its divine regulations permitted. Since it appeared that there was nothing more to be done, Mccartney decided to return to England via Guangzhou. As he prepared to depart, he observed that, after the emperor's sweeping rejection of Britain's requests, the mandarins were, if anything, more attentive, causing Mccartney to reflect that perhaps the court had had second thoughts. He inquired to that effect, but the Chinese were done with diplomatic courtesy. Since the barbarian supplicant did not seem to understand subtlety, he was treated to an imperial edict verging on the threatening. The emperor assured King George that he was aware of the lonely remoteness of your island, cut off from the world by intervening wastes of sea. But the Chinese capital was the hub and center about which all quarters of the globe revolve. The subjects of our dependencies have never been allowed to open places of business in Peking. Beijing. He concluded with an admonition. I have accordingly stated the facts to you in detail, and it is your bounden duty to reverently appreciate my feelings and to obey these instructions henceforward for all time, so that you may enjoy the blessings of perpetual peace. The emperor, clearly unfamiliar with the capacity of Western leaders for violent rapaciousness, was playing with fire, though he did not know it. The assessment with which Mccartney left China was ominous. A couple of English frigates would be an overmatch for the whole naval force of their empire. In half a summer they could totally destroy all the navigation of their coasts and reduce the inhabitants of the maritime provinces, who subsist chiefly on fish, to absolute famine. However overbearing the Chinese conduct may seem now, one must remember that it had worked for centuries in organizing and sustaining a major international order. In Mccartney's era, the blessings of trade with the West were far from self-evident, since China's GDP was still roughly 7 times that of Britain's. The emperor could perhaps be forgiven for thinking that it was London that needed Beijing's assistance and not the other way around. No doubt the imperial court congratulated itself on deft handling of this barbarian mission, which was not repeated for over 20 years. But the reason for this respite was less the skill of Chinese diplomacy than the Napoleonic wars, which consumed the resources of the European states. No sooner was Napoleon disposed of than a new British mission appeared off China's coasts in 1816, led by Lord Amherst. This time the standoff over protocol devolved into a physical brawl between the British envoys and the court mandarins assembled outside the throne room. When Amherst refused to kowtow to the emperor, whom the Chinese insisted on referring to as the universal sovereign, his mission was dismissed abruptly. Britain's Prince Regent was commanded to endeavor with obedience to make progress towards civilized transformation. In the meantime, no further ambassadors were necessary to prove that you are indeed our vassal. In 1834, the British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston sent another mission to attempt a grand resolution. Palmerston, not known for his expertise in Qing dynastic regulations, dispatched the Scottish naval officer Lord Napier with the contradictory instructions to conform to the laws and usages of China while, at the same time, requesting permanent diplomatic relations and a resident British embassy in Beijing, access to further ports along the Chinese coast, and, for good measure, free trade with Japan. Upon Napier's arrival in Guangzhou, he and the local governor settled into an impasse. Each refused to receive the other's letters on the basis that it would be demeaning to treat with a figure of such low station. Napier, whom the local authorities had, by this point, christened with a Chinese name translating as laboriously vile, took to posting belligerent broadsheets around Guangzhou using the services of a local translator. Fate finally solved this vexing barbarian problem for the Chinese when both Napier and his translator contracted malarial fever and departed this world. Before expiring, however, Napier did note the existence of Hong Kong, a sparsely populated rocky outcropping that he assessed would provide an excellent natural harbor. The Chinese could take satisfaction in having forced another round of rebellious barbarians into compliance. But it was the last time the British would accept rejection. With every year, British insistence grew more threatening. The French historian Alain Peyrefitte summed up the reaction in Britain in the aftermath of the Mccartney mission: if China remained closed, then the doors would have to be battered down. All of China's diplomatic maneuvers and abrupt rejections only delayed an inevitable reckoning with the modern international system, designed as it was along European and American lines. This reckoning would impose one of the most wrenching social, intellectual, and moral strains on Chinese society in its long history. The clash of two world orders. The Opium War. The ascendant Western industrial powers would clearly not abide for long a diplomatic mechanism that referred to them as barbarians presenting tribute or a tightly regulated seasonal trade at a single Chinese port city. For their part, the Chinese were willing to make limited concessions to Western merchants' appetite for profit, a vaguely immoral concept in Confucian thought, but they were appalled by the Western envoy's suggestions that China might be simply one state among many, or that it should have to live with permanent daily contact with barbarian envoys in the Chinese capital. To the modern eye, none of the Western envoy's initial proposals were particularly outrageous by the standards of the West. The goals of free trade, regular diplomatic contacts, and resident embassies offend few contemporary sensibilities and are treated as a standard way to conduct diplomacy. But the ultimate showdown occurred over one of the more shameful aspects of Western intrusion: the insistence on the unrestricted importation of opium into China. In the mid-19th century, opium was tolerated in Britain and banned in China, though consumed by an increasing number of Chinese. British India was the center of much of the world's opium poppy growth, and British and American merchants, working in concert with Chinese smugglers, did a brisk business. Opium was, in fact, one of the few foreign products that made any headway in the Chinese market. Britain's famed manufactures were dismissed as novelties or inferior to Chinese products. Polite Western opinion viewed the opium trade as an embarrassment. However, merchants were reluctant to forfeit the lucrative trade. The Qing court debated legalizing opium and managing its sale. It ultimately decided to crack down and eradicate the trade altogether. In 1839, Beijing dispatched Lin Zexu, an official of considerable demonstrated skill, to shut down the trade in Guangzhou and force Western merchants to comply with the official ban. A traditional Confucian Mandarin, Lin dealt with the problem as he would with any particularly stubborn barbarian issue, through a mixture of force and moral suasion. Upon arriving in Guangzhou, he demanded that the Western trade missions forfeit all of their opium chests for destruction. When that failed, he blockaded all of the foreigners, including those having nothing to do with the opium trade, in their factories, announcing that they would be released only on the surrender of their contraband. Lin next dispatched a letter to Queen Victoria, praising with what deference the traditional protocol allowed, the politeness and submissiveness of her predecessors in sending tribute to China. The crux of his missive was the demand that Queen Victoria take charge of the eradication of opium in Britain's Indian territories. And several places of India under your control, such as Bengal, Madras, Bombay, Patna, Benares and Malwa. Opium has been planted from hill to hill, and ponds have been opened for its manufacture. The obnoxious odor ascends, irritating heaven and frightening the spirits. Indeed you, O king, can eradicate the opium plant in these places, hoe over the fields entirely, and sow in its stead the 5 grains. Anyone who dares again attempt to plant and manufacture opium should be severely punished. The request was reasonable, even when couched in the traditional assumption of Chinese overlordship. Suppose a man of another country comes to England to trade, he still has to obey the English laws. How much more should he obey in China the laws of the Celestial dynasty? The barbarian merchants of your country, if they wish to do business for a prolonged period, are required to obey our statutes respectfully and to cut off permanently the source of opium. May you, O king, check your wicked and sift your vicious people before they come to China, in order to guarantee the peace of your nation, to show further the sincerity of your politeness and submissiveness, and to let the two countries enjoy together the blessings of peace. How fortunate indeed! After receiving this dispatch, will you immediately give us a prompt reply regarding the details and circumstances of your cutting off the opium traffic? Be sure not to put this off. Overestimating Chinese leverage, Lin's ultimatum threatened to cut off the export of Chinese products, which he supposed were existential necessities for the Western barbarians. If China cuts off these benefits with no sympathy for those who are to suffer, then what can the barbarians rely upon to keep themselves alive? China had nothing to fear from retaliation. Articles coming from the outside to China can only be used as toys. We can take them or get along without them. Lin's letter seems never to have reached Victoria. In the meantime, British opinion treated Lin's siege of the British community in Guangzhou as an unacceptable affront. Lobbyists for the China trade petitioned Parliament for a declaration of war. Palmerston dispatched a letter to Beijing demanding satisfaction and redress for injuries inflicted by Chinese authorities upon British subjects resident in China, and for insults offered by those same authorities to the British Crown, as well as the permanent cession of one or more sufficiently large and properly situated islands on the coast of China as a depot for British trade. In his letter, Palmerston acknowledged that opium was contraband under Chinese law, but he stooped to a legalistic defense of the trade, arguing that the Chinese ban had, under Western legal principles, lapsed due to the connivance of corrupt officials. This casuistry was unlikely to convince anybody, and Palmerston did not allow it to delay his fixed determination to bring matters to a head, in light of the urgent importance of the matter and the great distance separating England from China. The British government was ordering a fleet immediately to blockade the principal Chinese ports, seize all Chinese vessels which it may meet with, and seize some convenient part of Chinese territory until London obtained satisfaction. The Opium War had begun. Initial Chinese reactions rated the prospect of a British offensive as a baseless threat. One official argued to the Emperor that the vast distance between China and England would render the English impotent. The English barbarians are an insignificant and detestable race, trusting entirely to their strong ships and large guns, but the immense distance they have traversed will render the arrival of seasonable supplies impossible, and their soldiers, after a single defeat, being deprived of provisions, will become dispirited and lost. Even after the British blockaded the Pearl River and seized several islands opposite the port city of Ningbo as a show of force, Lin wrote indignantly to Queen Victoria, "You savages of the further seas have waxed so bold, it seems, as to defy and insult our mighty empire. Of a truth it is high time for you to flay the face and cleanse the heart, and to amend your ways. If you submit humbly to the celestial dynasty and tender your allegiance, it may give you a chance to purge yourselves of your past sins. Centuries of predominance had warped the celestial court's sense of reality. Pretension of superiority only accentuated the inevitable humiliation. British ships swiftly bypassed the Chinese coastal defenses and blockaded the main Chinese ports. The cannons once dismissed by Mccartney's Mandarin handlers operated with brutal effect. One Chinese official, Kishan, the viceroy of Zhili, the administrative division then encompassing Beijing and the surrounding provinces, came to understand China's vulnerability when he was sent to make preliminary contact with a British fleet that had sailed north to Tianjin. He recognized that the Chinese could not counter British seaborne firepower, without any wind, or even a favorable tide. They steam vessels glide along against the current, and are capable of fantastic speed. Their carriages are mounted on swivels, enabling the guns to be turned and aimed in any direction. By contrast, Kishan assessed that China's guns were left over from the Ming dynasty, and that Tihos who are in charge of military affairs are all literary officials. They have no knowledge of armaments. Concluding that the city was defenseless before British naval power, Kishan opted to soothe and divert the British by assuring them that the imbroglio in Guangzhou had been a misunderstanding, and did not reflect the temperate and just intentions of the emperor. Chinese officials would investigate and handle the matter fairly, but first it was imperative that the British fleet set sail for the south and await Chinese inspectors there. Somewhat remarkably, this maneuver worked. The British force sailed back to the southern ports, leaving China's exposed northern cities undamaged. Based on this success, Kishan was now sent to Guangzhou to replace Lin Zexu and to manage the barbarians once again. The emperor, who seems not to have grasped the extent of the British technological advantage, instructed Kishan to engage the British representatives in drawn-out discussions while China gathered its forces. After prolonged negotiation has made the barbarians weary and exhausted, he noted in the Vermilion imperial pen, we can suddenly attack them and thereby subdue them. Lin Zexu was dismissed in disgrace for having provoked a barbarian attack. He set off for internal exile in far western China, reflecting on the superiority of Western weaponry and drafting secret memorials advising that China develop its own. Once at his post in southern China, however, Kishan confronted a more challenging situation. The British demanded territorial concessions and an indemnity. They had come south to obtain satisfaction. They would no longer be deferred by procrastinating tactics. After British forces opened fire on several sites on the coast, Kishan and his British counterpart, Captain Charles Elliot, negotiated a draft agreement, the Chuanpai Convention, which granted the British special rights on Hong Kong, promised an indemnity of $6 million, and allowed that future dealings between Chinese and British officials would take place on equal terms, that is, the British would be spared the protocol normally reserved for barbarian supplicants. This deal was rejected by both the Chinese and the British governments, each of whom saw its terms as a humiliation for having exceeded his instructions and conceded too much to the barbarians. The emperor had Kishan recalled in chains and then sentenced to death. Later commuted to exile. The British negotiator, Charles Elliot, faced a somewhat gentler fate, although Palmerston rebuked him in the harshest terms for having gained far too little, throughout the whole course of your proceedings. Palmerston complained, "You seem to have considered that my instructions were waste paper." Hong Kong was a barren island with hardly a house upon it. Eliot had been far too conciliatory in not holding on to more valuable territory or pressing for harsher terms. Palmerston appointed a new envoy, Sir Henry Pottinger, whom he instructed to take a harder line, for Her Majesty's government cannot allow that, in a transaction between Great Britain and China, the unreasonable practice of the Chinese should supersede the reasonable practice of all the rest of mankind. Arriving in China, Pottinger pressed Britain's military advantage, blockading further ports and cutting traffic along the Grand Canal and lower Yangtze River. With the British poised to attack the ancient capital, Nanjing, the Chinese sued for peace. Chiang's diplomacy, soothing the barbarians. Pottinger now faced yet another Chinese negotiator, the third to be sent on this supremely unpromising assignment. By a court still fancying itself supreme in the universe, the Manchu Prince Chiang. Chiang's method for handling the British was a traditional Chinese strategy when confronted with defeat. Having tried defiance and diplomacy, China would seek to wear the barbarians down by seeming compliance. Negotiating under the shadow of the British fleet, Chiang judged that it befell the court's ministers to repeat what the Middle Kingdom's elites had done so often before, through a combination of delay, circumlocution, and carefully apportioned favors, they would soothe and tame the barbarians while buying time for China to outlast their assault. Chiang fixed his focus on establishing a personal relationship with the barbarian headman Pottinger. He showered Pottinger with gifts and took to addressing him as his cherished friend and intimate, a word specially transliterated into Chinese for this express purpose. As an expression of the deep friendship between them, Chiang went so far as to propose exchanging portraits of their wives and even proclaimed his wish to adopt Pottinger's son, who remained in England, but was henceforth known as Frederick King Pottinger. In one remarkable dispatch, Chiang explained the approach to a celestial court that found the seduction process difficult to comprehend. He described the ways he had aspired to appease the British barbarians, with this type of people from outside the bounds of civilization, who are blind and unawakened in styles of address and forms of ceremony. Even though our tongues were dry and our throats parched, from urging them to follow our way, still they could not avoid closing their ears and acting as if deaf. Therefore, Chiang's banquets and his extravagant warmth toward Pottinger and his family had served an essentially strategic design, in which Chinese conduct was calculated in specific doses and in which such qualities as trust and sincerity were weapons, whether they reflected convictions or not was secondary. He continued, "Certainly we have to curb them by sincerity, but it has been even more necessary to control them by skillful methods. There are times when it is possible to have them follow our directions but not let them understand the reasons. Sometimes we expose everything so that they will not be suspicious, whereupon we can dissipate their rebellious restlessness. Sometimes we have given them receptions and entertainment, after which they have had a feeling of appreciation. And at still other times we have shown trust in them in a broad-minded way and deemed it unnecessary to go deeply into minute discussions with them, whereupon we have been able to get their help in the business at hand. The results of this interplay between Western overwhelming force and Chinese psychological Management were two treaties negotiated by Qiying and Pottinger, the Treaty of Nanjing and the supplementary Treaty of the Bogue. The settlement conceded more than the Chuanpai Convention. It was essentially humiliating. Though the terms were less harsh than the military situation would have allowed Britain to impose. It provided for payment of a $6 million indemnity by China, the cession of Hong Kong, and the opening of 5 coastal treaty ports in which Western residence and trade would be permitted. This effectively dismantled the Canton system by which the Chinese court had regulated trade with the West and confined it to licensed merchants. Ningbo, Shanghai, Xiamen, and Fuzhou were added to the list of treaty ports. The British secured the right to maintain permanent missions in the port cities and to negotiate directly with local officials, bypassing the court in Beijing. The British also obtained the right to exercise jurisdiction over their nationals residing in the Chinese treaty ports. Operationally, this meant that foreign opium traders would be subject to their own country's laws and regulations, not China's. This principle of extraterritoriality, among the less controversial provisions of the treaty at the time, would eventually come to be treated as a major infringement of Chinese sovereignty. Since the European concept of sovereignty was unknown, however, in China, extraterritoriality came to be a symbol at the time, not so much of the violation of a legal norm as of declining imperial power. The resulting diminution of the mandate of heaven led to the eruption of a flurry of domestic rebellion. The 19th century English translator Thomas Meadows observed that most Chinese did not at first appreciate the lasting repercussions of the Opium War. They treated the concessions as an application of the traditional method of absorbing the barbarians and wearing them down. The great body of the nation, he surmised, can only look on the late war as a rebellious eruption of a tribe of barbarians, who, secure in their strong ships, attacked and took some places along the coast, and even managed to get into their possession an important point of the Grand Canal, whereby they forced the emperor to make certain concessions. But the Western powers were not so easily soothed. Every Chinese concession tended to generate additional Western demands. The treaties, conceived at first as a temporary concession, instead inaugurated a process by which the Qing court lost control of much of China's commercial and foreign policy. Following the British treaty, U.S. President John Tyler promptly sent a mission to China to gain similar concessions for the Americans, the forerunner of the later open-door policy. The French negotiated their own treaty with analogous terms. Each of these countries in turn included a most favored nation clause that stipulated that any concession offered by China to other countries must also be given to the signatory. Chinese diplomacy later used this clause to limit exactions by stimulating competition between the various claimants for special privilege. These treaties are justly infamous in Chinese history as the first in a string of unequal treaties conducted under the shadow of foreign military force. At the time, the most bitterly contested provisions were their stipulations of equality of status. China had until this point insisted on the superior position ingrained in its national identity and reflected in the tributary system. Now it faced a foreign power determined to erase its name from the roll of Chinese tribute states under threat of force and to prove itself the sovereign equal of the Celestial dynasty. The leaders on both sides understood that this was a dispute about far more than protocol or opium. The Qing court was willing to appease avaricious foreigners with money and trade, but if the principle of barbarian political Equality to the Son of Heaven was established, the entire Chinese world order would be threatened, the dynasty risked the loss of the mandate of heaven. Palmerston, in his frequently caustic communications to his negotiators, treated the amount of the indemnity as partly symbolic, but he devoted great attention to berating them for acquiescing to Chinese communications whose language revealed assumptions of superiority on the part of China or implied that Britain, victorious in war, remained a supplicant asking for the emperor's divine favor. Eventually, Palmerston's view prevailed, and the Treaty of Nanjing included a clause explicitly ensuring that Chinese and British officials would henceforth correspond on a footing of perfect equality. It went so far as to list specific written Chinese characters in the text with acceptably neutral connotations. Chinese records, or at least those to which foreigners had access, would no longer describe the British as begging Chinese authorities or tremblingly obeying their orders. The Celestial Court had come to understand the military inferiority of China, but not yet the appropriate method for dealing with it. At first, it applied the traditional methods of barbarian management. Defeat was not unknown in the course of China's long history. China's rulers had dealt with it by applying the 5 baits described in the previous chapter. They saw the common characteristic of these invaders as being their desire to partake of Chinese culture. They wished to settle on Chinese soil and partake of its civilization. They could therefore gradually be tamed by some of the psychological methods illustrated by Prince Qiying and, in time, become part of Chinese life. But the European invaders had no such aspiration nor limited goals. Deeming themselves more advanced societies, their goal was to exploit China for economic gain, not to join its way of life. Their demands were therefore limited only by their resources and their greed. Personal relationships could not be decisive, because the chiefs of the invaders were not neighbors but lived thousands of miles away, where they were governed by motivations obtuse to the subtleness and indirection of the Qiying type of strategy. Within the space of a decade, the Middle Kingdom had gone from preeminence to being an object of contending colonial forces. Poised between 2 eras and 2 different conceptions of international relations, China strove for a new identity, and above all, to reconcile the values that marked its greatness with the technology and commerce on which it would have to base its security.